Hello, my name is Stacey Camp, and I am going to be moderating our discussion about the film today. Before I move forward doing so, I'm going to introduce our two panelists today. First, there's Koji Lau-Ozawa, and he is a historical archaeologist whose research examines the intersecting realms of landscapes, diaspora, material culture, and memory. His dissertation focuses on the archaeology of the Japanese diaspora, examining the material connections and landscapes of Japanese American communities. In particular, he has worked in collaboration with the Gila River Indian community to investigate the World War II site of Gila River incarceration camp. A second site of investigation, which was in the film today, looks at the material culture of a pre-World War II urban Japanese American community in Santa Barbara. These research projects are supported by the Werner Gren Foundation, the Japanese American Confinement Sites Grant Program through National Park Service, as well as from the Society for California Archaeology and Stanford University. Before Stanford, he studied at San Francisco State University and the University of Edinburgh and worked for 8 years in the archaeology in the Bay Area for the National Park Service and Stanford Heritage Services. Second, we have Director Barre Fong. Director Barre Fong is a fourth-generation Chinese-American and San Francisco native. Barre's activities as a filmmaker and community activist is an embodiment of his grandfather's dream of preserving his own experience as a turn-of-the-century Chinese immigrant. He previously served as the president of the board of directors for the Chinese Historical Society of America and leads a consulting group that champions diversity, equity, and inclusion in nonprofit organizations. He has produced and directed short films about the Asian American experience since 2013. His film, Finding the Virgo, is now nationally available on public television. And just a brief introduction as to why I'm here. My name is Stacey Camp. I'm a professor of anthropology and archaeology at Michigan State University, and my research focuses on the archaeology of Idaho's Kusiki internment camp, a World War II Japanese American incarceration facility. So thank you, Koji and Barre, for being on today, and we're excited to talk to you. And if you have questions, please put them in the comment box here so we can ask them. I'm just going to check quickly to make sure I haven't missed any questions yet. And if either one of you see some, please throw them in. So the first question I had is, both of you tell stories about pasts and histories that have been neglected or made invisible in different ways. And you use different mediums to tell those stories. You use archaeology, Koji, and film. Barre, so can you tell me how film and archaeology really bring those stories alive? And either one of you are welcome to start, or jump in.
Koji? Oh, looks like we might have lost Koji for a second. I'll start and let Koji fill in. Archaeology, I actually made several films that include archaeology. And as you mentioned, I'm very interested in telling stories about erased and ignored history. And Santa Barbara's Japantown is a prime example. And so what archaeology does is it gives proof that those people were there. They were actually there. They left physical evidence. It's very hard to erase things that are left in the ground. So I think that's what's fascinating about archaeology, and it leads to what Koji and his cohort are so good at is expanding the stories about these small items, these little details, where they came from, how they're used, and why they were left in the ground.
Great, thank you, Koji. I don't know if you can hear. Can you hear us? You there? Oh, I can't hear you. Let's see. I'm gonna check. Worst case scenario, Koji, you can type it in the private chat and I can share it. We can share it out. Okay, Koji's going to turn his camera off for just a minute. We'll see how that goes. His poor computer is not working very well. Okay, Barre, I have a question for you. We'll go to you again. And when Koji comes back, I'll repeat the question too. So you've done a really fantastic job of weaving together so many different parts of the story of Nihonmachi. Like, I'm amazed as an archaeologist because I just focus on a few like data points, right? But you're bringing all of these different stories and data together. And I was wondering, as someone who isn't in film, and I imagine other audience viewers are curious about this too, can you kind of give us some insight into the thought process of like, where do you start when you try to tell a story like this? And then how do you bring it together so beautifully? Like, this is such a poignant ending, and I'm just really impressed with your ability. So I would love to know more about that thought process.
Thank you. That's a nice compliment. So it is simply storytelling, and I think that I'm descended from some great storytellers of my grandparents that I remember listening to them around the dining table, telling stories about their childhoods and their parents' lives, and I think that's all that this is. And I'm interested in making sure that the audience can follow along. I think this audience here today understands the history already, and it's very easy to communicate those things to them. What I want is someone at Michigan, in Michigan or Wisconsin or Iowa, to be able to turn this 20-30 minute movie on and really understand the history and really understand the pain that happened to American citizens, and to technically, for documentary filmmaking, what I try to do is gather as much as I can. I am not a historian. I'm not an expert, so I am listening and learning as fast as I can about these stories and about the history, and then I'm trying to gather what we have and look through a lot of video, dozens of hours of video, and then trying to pull out the story from that, pull out the threads that really would make sense, hopefully, to other people when they're watching.
Great, thank you. So if you made a second movie about this project, where would you go next?
Yeah, I think for sure this is unfinished work, because we started in I think 2019. We started filming those first interviews, and we expected to do more in 2020, and obviously we could not. And Zoom, was very useful in capturing your interview, but we'd love to do those things in person. They're just much better. And we cut short a lot of the other interviews we wanted to do in Santa Barbara. There are other subjects we would like to talk to, but I think it's unfinished in that there are some things like the role that religion and the churches played in Nihonmachi that are enormous, pre-incarceration, post-incarceration, the support that, that was the gathering point, the center for that community, the two churches on that block. So that's something I'd love to touch on. I'd love to go back and talk about agriculture. I think that was the thing that kept that community thriving and growing. And there were challenges, but I think it's a huge part of California's history.
Absolutely. I personally, one of the things I was really interested in is the interaction between the Chinese American and Japanese American community as well, and kind of bringing those two stories together. I don't know how you do that as a filmmaker, since I'm not a filmmaker, but I think those overlapping histories in Santa Barbara are really interesting as well. We got Koji back. Let's see if your audio works, Koji. Welcome back.
Can you both hear me now?
We can, yes. How about I repeat my questions so that you'll hear it again? How about that? Sound good? Okay. So both of you tell stories about past and histories that have been neglected or made invisible using these different mediums, right? Film and archaeology. So can you, Koji, tell me how film and archaeology bring those stories alive for us?
Sure, and apologies about all the audio glitches. I think archaeology and film can be really powerful tools of interpretation especially for the public. One of the things that drew me as somebody who does archaeology is the really tangible aspects of it. The ability to see the things that people interacted with, the objects that they used every day, bring and connect to history in, I think, a different way than text or archives do. And so I think that's been really powerful. And then I've been really fortunate to work with Barre, whose work really connects and weaves those stories together, I think, in really powerful ways, in ways that moved really beyond articles or even museum exhibits, that the power of film to tell a story and to present those narratives through visual and audio means is just incredibly important. And I think I see a lot more of the future of public outreach trying to experiment with these different mediums.
Great, thank you. We have a couple questions from our audience viewers. So I don't know the answer to this, Koji, you might. Who was the mayor of Santa Barbara when the incarcerees left for the camps? And who was the mayor when they came back? Don't know that one.
Boy, I wish I could tell you right now off the top of my head who the mayor was. I can tell you that, so I don't have that answer. I can try to get that for you. But I do know that in Santa Barbara, at the time of incarceration, there were sort of mixed reactions to it. There's a portion of the Santa Barbara community who was very connected to the Japanese American community and welcomed people back when they returned. I think Roki talks a little bit about, even in our discussions, about his baseball teammates welcoming him back, and that was a huge relief after going to camp. But there were also definitely people in the political community in Santa Barbara that had very anti-Japanese sentiments. Thank you, Kimiko, who looked it up, that Patrick Joseph Marr was the mayor in 1945, and Herbert E. Weiler, W-E-Y-L-E-R, was the mayor when people came back. So there were sort of mixed elements of the politics around removal in Santa Barbara in the 1940s. And Santa Barbara County was the only site of a brief attack on the U.S. mainland. There was some shelling of not very successful shelling. There were no injuries, thankfully, of a site near Santa Barbara County in the early days of the war, which I think really raised public sentiment and anti-Japanese sentiment in that area. And so, you know, a recurring theme that you even see today when, as nation states sort of start to clash, members of the ethnic communities really become the targets. And so the politics get manifested in these anti-Japanese sentiments locally, which is what we saw in 1942, and of course what we see some today with anti-Asian sentiments still.
See a second question from our audience members, and I think sort of answered some of this, Koji, but I'll ask it anyhow. Back in the early 1940s, were there any political religious advocacy for the Japanese Americans at that time in Santa Barbara?
So the Christian church and the in particular, actually, the Quaker church were very active in opposing anti-Japanese sentiments. In Southern California, more generally, there were organizations that were set up that were friends of the Japanese American community or Friends of the American, I think it was the Friends of the American Way, that opposed the grounds of incarceration. Herbert Nicholson was a minister that was very involved with both being vocally opposed to incarceration as well as visiting incarcerees while they were in camp, bringing goods, bringing property, things from back home to the camps. And he was a very pivotal figure and has popped up in oral histories, actually ones that I've done both in Santa Barbara as well as other places like Pasadena, Central California. People remember Herbert Nicholson. I think Mitchie Weglin actually wrote the foreword to a biography of him, talking about his involvement in opposition.
Oh, thank you. There was a comment, and I just share it. Thanks to all for producing the film. I was moved by the stories. What the carefully buried sets of dishes truly represent. I've lived here since 1970 and have only had hints of this truth. And that really hit home to me, that last part of the sentence, that it does feel like the story is literally buried underneath Santa Barbara, just navigating that space in which people had lived. It doesn't feel like we have that history coming alive. I know the Presidio has an exhibit on Nihonmachi, but that's really kind of the only sense you get that people were there. So how do you both play a role in trying to bring this story to light and make people that live in this community know what happened, people who don't have descendants that lived in the community?
I'll just say really quickly, and then I'll pass it back to Barry, since I know I've been talking a lot. Barry and I have talked a bunch about the way in which these communities, Japantowns, Chinatowns, these sort of ethnic enclaves, which are often in the hearts of many urban areas, have been pushed out through redevelopment and gentrification over the years, especially in the post-war years. That has become a big erasure, a marker of erasure of these communities, and has created huge amounts of economic loss over the years, but also huge amounts of sort of historic amnesia, where once the stores and the livelihoods and the communities are displaced from an area, their legacies in that, in those towns and in those really those places where they've built up the community become forgotten, unless there are really concerted efforts to combat that, which, I think the Santa Barbara Trust has been trying to help tell that story, local communities in Santa Barbara as well as in other urban areas. But it's a story that I think we see commonly across other sites of displacement when you see that kind of redevelopment in these downtown areas.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that 1 or 2 square blocks in Santa Barbara has such a complex history, right? From the natives that were there, driven out, Presidio that was there, the people that came to live in the Presidio, then the Japanese and Chinese living there, and then they're driven out. And so I think it's super complex history and layered, and I think Mike mentions that in the film, and I think we're just starting to wrestle with it now. 2021, we're realizing that this is an important part of what makes us as citizens, and wherever we can put effort and dollars and focus and attention, we can continue to educate people so that it does not get forgotten.
Yes, I don't know, Barry, if this is a possibility, but are there any opportunities to get your film in public schools in the area, or just in California curriculum in general?
I actually just got an email yesterday that Illinois passed a law that Asian American history is required to be taught in grammar schools, and I was asked to provide a catalog of the films that I've made for submission. So I think it's slow and sure, and hopefully we'll get there.
That's fantastic news. Should have happened a long time ago, but that's wonderful. It's wonderful. I see there's a question. How did Ken Kishio become involved in your project?
Oh, so Ken is somebody that I've met in my work on Gila River, actually. Ken lives in the Phoenix area, and we would see each other when I go out to participate in the volunteer cleanups that the local Japanese American Citizens League does of a monument of Butte Camp at Gila River. And Ken is a great musician, and was very generous. And when I reached out to him and asked him if he would help provide some music to our film.
That's great. That's great. Okay, another question. We have great questions today. Have you discovered any other Nihonmachis in California that have been lost in a similar fashion to Santa Barbara?
So there are Nihonmachis all over California that have been lost. I think there are only really 3 that remain today. I think there are only 3 historic Japantowns really that remain in the U.S., which are in San Francisco, San Jose, and Los Angeles. And then after that, the International District in Seattle, also has strong sort of remnants of that historical community. But in my work, I've seen Japantowns in all sorts of different areas. There was one that I was surprised recently in Vacaville. I was talking to my sister, and she moved up to Vacaville and had no idea that there was a Japantown there. But there's a whole historical community that in the late 90s and early 2000s had published like a history of Vacaville's Japantown, but there's almost no trace of it today. And so I think that's a very common occurrence across a lot of towns in California.
Another question, could you talk more about caching? Are archaeologists currently trying to find items that may have been buried by folks on the West Coast prior to incarceration?
So caching, as I sort of talked about a little bit in the film, this idea of putting things away as a group intentionally has been a focus or a part of archaeological research for, I'm sure Stacey could probably tell you more, but since as far as I've known archaeology, and it's been, I think really integral to what we know about the past. In regards to burying things on the West Coast prior to incarceration, I don't think there are many ongoing archaeological projects about that, but there have been stories I remember reading in Duncan Williams's work on Buddhism in the camps, American Sutra, in particular religious and leaders burying sutra and other sort of very visually significant culturally Japanese items. And there have been some stories of them throughout the Bay Area and other parts of California. And I'm sure they're out there. They're on properties. There was one story that came up, I think, in the San Jose Mercury News that discussed those things. So I think there's potential to look for these sort of lost segments of cultural history.
Yes, absolutely. If you have any final questions for our panelists, please type them in the comments. I had another question for Koji, and this is, a personal interest of mine as an archaeologist studying World War II Japanese American incarceration camps. Have you noticed any differences or similarities between the pre-World War II cultural material that you've recovered from Nihonmachi and what you found at Gila River?
So there are some similarities, and there are lots of differences. There's a lot of discontinuities. So, for instance, a really common, I think, item in pre-World War II assemblages are medicine bottles from Japan, Japanese medicine bottles. And I think that sort of healthcare and personal medication was really common before the war and very common in Japanese and a lot of Asian American communities generally, this sort of medicine that that comes from Japan or we see the same, I think, in Chinese American communities. We see Chinese medicines. You see none of that in the incarceration camps. I haven't seen a single Japanese medicine bottle in any of the work I've done in incarceration camps. I think there might be some out there. There were certainly attempts, like people writing to pharmacies to try to access that kind of medicine, but you see a real blockage during the war of that material and a change in practices. You also see, of course, a change in the types of materials and things people eat off of. I know at Gila River, for instance, there are primarily plates, large, big plates that people are eating in the mess halls, and some bowls that people took into camp with them. But in pre-World War II assemblages, it's almost all, tons of bowls, tons of small plates, which are very common in sort of Japanese tableware that get rearranged by the process of incarceration. So I think you really see the incarceration impacting people's habits from healthcare to their dining. in really subtle ways that we don't necessarily see explicitly happen, but change people's behaviors.
Yeah, that I will say, Koji, we have one medicine bottle from Japan that we found at Kuski, and I think it is the only medicine bottle that I've seen in other archaeological reports that have been found at a World War II Japanese American incarceration site. And it obviously predated the war. Someone had brought it with them. So that's it in our assemblage, and our assemblage is pretty big. So any other questions? I see someone added that things were buried at places other than the West Coast. My grandparents' samurai sword and other belongings are buried in Green River, Wyoming, now under a concrete slab. Wow. Koji, Barry, who first came up with the idea to do this film?
Koji.
Barry's blaming me. I'd worked with Barry on a previous project, and as I was doing this work, I thought it was a good story that needed to be told, and that Barry had the talent and know-how to tell it.
I wanted to add something that, as we were talking about making this film and doing the first interviews, Koji said, I don't really want to make a film that's too focused on on incarceration, because there are so many incredible, and this festival has had shown so many incredible, great films about incarceration. But then as we started going through it, and as I started to, understand the history, you can't avoid it, because the contrast is so great between the thriving, strong community before incarceration and then this scattered, shattered community that, that tries to keep itself together after incarceration.
I think we have one more question. Were the Nihonmachis established by people from specific places in Japan? That's a great question.
So Nihonmachi generally, Japantown is generally, I think, were centers for people from all over Japan, but certainly there were strong streams of prefectural identity involved in them. Santa Barbara, for instance, had an overwhelming population of people from Kumamoto Prefecture, and that really sort of, there was a Kumamoto Kenjinkai, over prefectural society in there. Places like Terminal Island had people from Wakayama Prefecture. And so you see, especially as people immigrate to the United States and settle in various areas throughout the US, these strong prefectural identities, especially from Yamaguchi, Hiroshima, Kumamoto, Fukuoka, Okinawa, which has a very obviously distinct identity, which has been discussed in other panels at Tadaima. These groups within the overall Japanese American community forming based on where they're coming from in Japan, or in the greater sort of Japanese empire at the time.
Do you think there were different material signatures based off where people came from in Japan, Koji? Could that be teased out archaeologically?
I think that's one of the sort of next questions. I think for historical archaeology of the sort of Japanese diaspora, that it's just in its sort of early stages of formation, and there's been a lot of focus on identifying things coming from Japan. And the next step is to start to look at where in Japan they're coming from and what kind of different identities form. I would be almost surprised if that wasn't apparent in the signature, especially places, I'm positive that, for instance, the Okinawan American material signature is different than other Japanese American communities, just because Ryukyu and Okinawan culture is so different than, it has so many different influences. And I'm sure that also comes into Kumamoto, Hiroshima, Wakayama, Aichiken, like all these different prefectures, very different regional dialects, ways of speaking, commercial networks that I think we're just starting to think about and try to tease out.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're getting close to the end of it. I want to double check. We don't have 15 more minutes. Yes, it's supposed to end at 3. I'll double check. We can have 15 more minutes if we want. So if there's any other questions from the audience members, please type them in to the chat. I wanted to say thank you to all the audience members for these fantastic questions. One of the questions I had for Barry, as someone who is a parent and trying to teach my children about things that sometimes aren't mentioned in their public school curriculum still here in Michigan, is when you make these films, do you think, what is the age range for your audience? Or do you try to direct it to everyone out there, like, you know, children from 7 years to elders?
Yeah, I think we go for, you know, G-rated, and but there are definitely some topics that come up in these films. You know, there's the rioting and the murders that, you know, come up, and I think so I raised my kids treating them like adults, and so when those topics came up, I just tried to be as real with them as possible, that you know, there were some horrific things and still horrific things that happened in the world, and it's real, and it happened, and it's part of our history, and to learn it helps us not make the same mistakes again.
Absolutely. All right, well, I think we'll wrap it up since we don't have any other questions. Koji or Barry, do you want to add anything to this discussion or ask questions of each other?
Well, I would just say thank you so much for having us. It's an honor to screen at this festival and to have an audience watch any film. The film doesn't live without an audience, so thank you very, very much, and thank you, Stacey.
You're welcome. Thank you, Koji, for joining us too and sharing all of your knowledge and research. I know it's hard to summarize your dissertation research into short sentences that are for this festival. So I appreciate the time and effort you put into doing this. So thank you.
Well, I'm grateful to be able to participate and, you know, help support the great work that Tadaima has been doing to keep both the memory, but also the community that has sprung up around these historical moments and these historical groups of memory. And I think Tadaima, especially during the pandemic, has been really the leader in that. And so thank you for having us and including us in this legacy.
Absolutely. Thank you to the organizers of Tadaima. It's been a lot of work for them and a labor of love. So we appreciate it as well. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.